Hi everyone, this is Dr. Krishnan.K, and in the previous class we have discussed about the lobes of the cerebrum and how they are separated by some major sulci and gyri. So let's have a revision over the same. So here you can see the frontal lobe, which is demarcated by major sulcus here, that is the central sulcus. Then you have the parietal lobe, which is demarcated between the central sulcus and the parieto-occipital sulcus. Then you have the temporal lobe, which is separated by the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus, and a few imaginary lines behind that we have discussed over the last class, so I'm not going back to the details. And here you have the other lobe, that is the occipital lobe. And today we'll be discussing about the major sulci and gyri which are present within each of these particular lobes. So let's have a look into it. On the superolateral surface of the cerebrum, the frontal lobe consists of a precentral sulcus. So as the name suggests, the precentral sulcus lies just behind the central sulcus, and there is a space in between these two. And that space or the area between the precentral sulcus and the central sulcus is termed as the precentral gyrus. And in the region of frontal lobe, anterior to the precentral sulcus, is again subdivided by two anteroposteriorly running sulci or sulcus, and they are the superior frontal sulcus and the inferior frontal sulcus respectively. So these sulci divides the area in front of the precentral sulcus into three parts, that is the superior frontal gyrus, the middle frontal gyrus, and the inferior frontal gyrus. So let's discuss the same over the diagram. So here we have a replica where you can concentrate on the frontal lobe here. So this is the central sulcus, and just behind the central sulcus you can find the precentral sulcus, and the area between the central and precentral sulcus is termed as the precentral gyrus. And the region in front of the precentral sulcus and which lies on the frontal lobe is again divided into three by two horizontally running anteroposteriorly running sulci. They are the superior frontal sulcus and the inferior frontal sulcus. And these two sulci will divide the area in front of the precentral sulcus into three, which are the superior frontal gyrus, the middle frontal gyrus, and the inferior frontal gyrus. So there is some little bit of detailing in case of inferior frontal gyrus. So I have made a magnified picture of the same here, where you can see the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus and two extended rami. So these are nothing but the extensions of the lateral sulcus, which are namely the anterior ramus of lateral sulcus and the ascending ramus of lateral sulcus. So these two will again divide the inferior frontal gyrus into three parts. So we will see that in the next slide. So here the anterior and ascending rami of the lateral sulcus extends into the inferior frontal gyrus and divides it into three parts. That is the pars orbitalis, which lies below the anterior ramus, the pars triangularis between the anterior and ascending rami, and the pars opercularis, that is the posterior to the ascending ramus. So let's revise the same. Here you can see this is ascending ramus, anterior ramus. So the pars orbitalis comes below the anterior ramus of lateral sulcus. So this area represents the pars orbitalis, and pars triangularis lies between the ascending ramus and the anterior ramus, and the area here represents the pars opercularis. So these are the three areas in addition to that of the other three gyrus. So this concludes the sulci and gyri which are present on the frontal lobe. Let's move to the temporal lobe, where two sulci runs parallel to the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, and they are the superior temporal sulcus and the inferior temporal sulcus, and they divide the lobe into three gyrus, namely the superior temporal gyrus, the middle temporal gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus. It's very easy to remember. So let's talk over the diagram. So here you can see the temporal lobe here, which is divided into three by two sulci which are running anteroposteriorly, namely the superior temporal sulcus and the inferior temporal sulcus. That divides the temporal lobe into the superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus. So this concludes the temporal lobe. The next one is the parietal lobe, which lies behind the central sulcus, as you remember the diagram. So here there is a sulcus named as the post-central sulcus, which lies after the central sulcus, and it lies parallel to that of the central sulcus, and the area between the central and post-central sulcus is named as the post-central gyrus, and the rest of the parietal lobe behind or after the post-central sulcus is divided into two lobules. They are the superior parietal lobule and the inferior parietal lobule by the intraparietal sulcus. I repeat, the area after the post-central gyrus or the post-central sulcus is again divided into two by an intraparietal sulcus. And in addition to that, there are two other gyrus, namely the supramarginal gyrus and the angular gyrus. So let's have a diagrammatic representation of the same. Here this is central sulcus, hence it is the post-central sulcus, and the area between these two is the post-central gyrus, and the area behind the post-central sulcus here is again divided into two by a horizontal sulcus which is named as the intraparietal sulcus. This is intraparietal sulcus, which divides the area into superior parietal lobule and an inferior parietal lobule. And in addition to this, there are two gyri situated here in the parietal lobe. One that is just above the upturned part of the termination of the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, and that gyrus is termed as the supramarginal gyrus. And the next one is at the end point of the superior temporal sulcus, which is upturned here, and this represents the next gyrus, that is the angular gyrus. So in the parietal lobe, we will revise once again the post-central gyrus, then the superior parietal lobule, the inferior parietal lobule, and the intraparietal sulcus which separates them, then the supramarginal gyrus and the angular gyrus. So hope you understood the same. So this is the diagrammatic representation. So the next lobe is the occipital lobe, where it is having two major sulci, that is the lateral occipital sulcus, which lies horizontally, dividing the occipital lobe into a superior and inferior occipital gyri, and the lunate sulcus, which runs downwards and slightly forward just in front of the occipital pole. So here we have a representation. This is the imaginary line which separates the occipital lobe from the other lobes. Here you can see a horizontal sulcus which is termed as the lateral occipital sulcus, which separates the occipital lobe into the superior occipital gyrus and the inferior occipital gyrus. And you can see a sulcus which runs downwards and forwards and just above the occipital pole here, and that is termed as the lunate sulcus, as it is having a lunate shape. So this is the occipital pole. Just above that you can see a sulcus which runs downwards and forwards, and that is termed as the lunate sulcus. So this concludes the major sulci and gyri which you have to study on the superolateral surface of the cerebrum. So in the corresponding slides we will be discussing about the medial surface and the inferior surface and the important sulci and gyri present in them. Thank you.